So one project that I'm also excited about is looking at the effect of an environmental regulation in China on the performance and productivity of industrial firms. So the industrial sector is one that's extremely pollution intensive, and especially in China over the last 10-20 years, given a lot of the development that has happened. And what we are doing is testing whether that regulation increased or decreased their performance and productivity, because the common narrative around how environmental regulation might impact the economy is typically that economic growth and environmental regulation are at odds with each other. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So we might think, okay, yes, environmental regulation can be costly to implement, to enforce, or perhaps it kind of shifts the composition of industries within an economy. But at the same time, it provides incentives for firms to innovate, because in order to comply, they might need to adopt or develop new technologies, processes, or practices. And then at the same time, air pollution or other types of pollution has negative effects on economic development and growth in the sense that it hurts our health. It's been shown, there's actually increasing evidence now that air pollution itself can reduce labor supply, so how frequently people can go to work. Air pollution can also kind of dampen students' ability to learn and reduce test scores. So we can think about how these negative environmental externalities and pollution do have these implications for growth that are negative. And so addressing them might have this positive effect on development, as opposed to environmental regulation always just be costly. And so in this work, what we're doing is saying, well, what exactly is that narrative that we typically see in policy, the policy world and policy discussions? Do these two, do economic growth and environmental regulation, have to be at odds with each other? And so we empirically, with all of this data on all industrial firms in China, we estimate the effect of this environmental regulation on their, say, their productivity. So productivity is typically a measure that has been shown, productivity and innovation has been shown to be a key contributor to economic growth. And so if this regulation actually enhances firm productivity, then we can think about this environmental regulation as actually being good for socioeconomic development. And the ways in which we might think that it could be a negative effect would be if the environmental regulation is just too costly. But at the same time, it could have these positive effects in the sense that it induces firms to adopt these new or develop new technologies, processes, and practices that might make their operations more efficient. And so what we're finding is that this environmental regulation actually has pretty strong positive effects on these firms' performance and productivity on average. So the productivity increases by about 5% on average, particularly for these industrial firms that are a little bit less pollution intensive, but still polluted and still polluting and still regulating. But then it has, at the same time, almost no effect or a slightly positive effect on the firms that are in these most pollution intensive industries. So what this is basically saying is that this dialogue that's typically found in the policy discourse, as well as in the economic literature, is that environmental regulation in this case is actually enhancing productivity, which then can filter through to economic growth and development. And what we can show also is that the ways in which firms are achieving this differs depending on whether it's a private firm or a state-owned enterprise. So China has this kind of long history of implementing and enforcing regulations differently for the private sector versus the state-owned firms. And what we can find is that these private firms are achieving these productivity gains primarily through improving the productivity of their labor and their inputs, which implies that they are innovating in their processes and practices. On the other hand, the state-owned enterprises, it does not appear as though the regulation is enforced in the same way. They are achieving productivity gains, but our evidence suggests that they might be benefiting from some type of government favoritism, perhaps in being favored in some type of sales contract or public procurement after the policy is implemented to basically allow them to survive. And so what that then tells us is actually that enforcement, or the strength of institutions, is extremely important for environmental regulation to have these positive effects, or to provide the incentive for firms to innovate. And without that, firms do not have that incentive, and this might help to explain some of the perhaps negative effects or the null effects that we find of typically in some of the economics literature of the impact of environmental regulation on firm performance.